When you talk about the Millennium Development Goals, I think you have to trace back in the history of ideas what started in 1990 as the idea of human development. So you had 10 years of a human development movement, in a sense, I would argue, influencing strongly the articulation of the Millennium Development Goals. And the influence of the idea of human development has been very significant across the world, and particularly in developing countries. It was an idea promoted by UNDP. It was led by Professor Amartya Sen, the Nobel Prize economist, and the late Mehboob Haq, and a whole lot of other social scientists who came together. And you should recall that the period 1990 or the 2 or 3 years preceding that were very important years in world history. You saw the collapse of the Soviet Union, you saw the breakup of Eastern Europe, you saw the unification of Germany. So a lot of changes were taking place in the world, and people came to realize that all this material prosperity that you saw in terms of buildings, in terms of comforts of living, were important, but were not capturing the essence of human progress. And therefore, the idea of human development argued that, listen, when you're talking about progress, and in fact, you refer to the media, even if you take India, for instance, at this point of time, much of the debate and discussion is on the growth rate. India is doing exceptionally well, by the way. We're growing between 8 and 9% GDP every year, which is fantastic, having recovered from the global recession and so on. If you're coming to Delhi after a few years, you'll be amazed at the transformation of the city. But does that really capture the essence of human progress? And therefore, I think what you see in the articulation of the MDGs, the MDGs were influenced by this very important question of what is progress in society across the countries, across the world. And the human development idea suggests that you have to look at freedoms, you have to look at opportunities. And so you may find there's a lot of growth happening, but if economic freedoms are not expanding, if political freedoms are not expanding, even as we are talking today, you saw the situation in Egypt. I mean, it's not that over 30 years Egypt has not seen any economic progress. In fact, in the last few years, they've had positive rates of growth, their inflation is under control, they initiated economic reforms. But the revolt there was much more for political freedoms, that political freedoms are as important as economic freedoms. And you may be struggling in a democracy, but it is much better to struggle in a democracy to achieve the vision and the aspirations of people than to be stuck in an autocratic society. And so the idea of human development, I think, influenced the shaping of the MDGs significantly, and I'll relate them to the goals in a minute. But also, you should step back from the MDGs and say that when the world leaders got together in 2000, it started with endorsing a Millennium Declaration. And the declaration talked about 6 fundamental values. And I think that is where the importance of the United Nations comes in. That in moments of crisis, in moments of difficulty, some voice that brings together all nations and all societies and all peoples is absolutely critical. And the 6 fundamental values that the Millennium Declaration talks about starts with freedoms. And that's where I said the big shift that the Human Development Reports and the influence of the UNDP made to global thinking and to local policy, national policy, is that all this material wealth is important, but you have to answer the question, are women and children in India enjoying greater freedoms? Are political freedoms expanding? Are social freedoms expanding? So that became an important issue. The second emphasis of the Millennium Declaration was on the value of equality. And again, today in the global discourse, equality is central to what we are talking about. You cannot have societies where certain sections are doing exceptionally well and making extraordinary progress when the others are not. So equality is ingrained in the idea of the Millennium Development Goals. So is solidarity, tolerance, respect for nature, and shared values and shared experiences. So there is a big importance one has to recognize that for the MDGs that derives both from looking at progress in terms of freedoms and incorporating a lot of these shared values. Now, if you look at the MDGs, I don't know if you were following the debates in the early 2000s when they were launched, there was a lot of skepticism. Who decided these goals? Were these goals, because if you look at them, most of them are to do with eliminating poverty, improving child survival, ensuring gender equality, improving maternal mortality, education, and so on, which are sort of goals that are set for developing countries. And so I recall the initial debates when some of the people from the developing countries said, hey, these are all meant for poor countries, yeah? But what are the obligations of the developed world? What are they planning to do? And I recall some very intensive discussions where they said, why doesn't the developed world argue for nuclear disarmament and say that by the year 2020, all countries will do away with nuclear arms? Why don't the developed countries say that they will reduce the manufacture and production of arms and ammunitions? In fact, most of the members of the Security Council are also the largest manufacturers of small arms, which has contributed to a lot of killing and violence, and it falls into wrong hands, and the insecurity that we are experiencing. So there's a concern again that many of these goals were intended, so there was a bit of a tension in the beginning. But I think there was no denying the fact that these 7 goals that were announced were fundamental to at least the developing world, and that there has to be a collective effort to get them going. And the lesson that the world had learned when you talked about other declarations and the difference with the MDGs is the interconnectedness of these goals. So you cannot reduce income poverty without addressing issues of ill health, illiteracy, lack of power,